On this episode of Journey to Planet Earth, meet environmental visionary Lester Brown as he travels from world capital to world capital during a recent press and lecture tour of Asia and Europe.
It is clear that Plan A, business as usual, is no longer a viable option.
We're looking at a race between tipping points, between natural tipping points and political tipping points.
Lester Brown's message has always been clear and unflinching. Either confront the realities of climate change or suffer the consequences of lost civilizations and failed states.
The question becomes, how many failing states before we have a failing global civilization?
With degrees in both agronomy and economics, and author of over 50 books in some 40 languages, for over 4 decades, Lester Brown has been sharing ideas with heads of state and some of the world's most original and influential thinkers.
If we, the original Americans, don't redefine in more sustainable terms what it means to be an American, we're going to heat up, choke up, smoke up, and devour up this earth.
We're really on the cusp of this sort of fundamental restructuring of the energy system in a way that, and on a scale that we've never really tried before.
For those seeking a realistic strategy to avoid the growing threat of climate change, please join us on a journey marked by unexpected twists and turns. Though Lester Brown's odyssey will ultimately take us around the world, we begin his story here, on a soundstage in the middle of Washington, D.C. I'm Matt Damon. All this and much more when we return to this special edition of Journey to Planet Earth.
Camera 1, take your position. Camera 2, start your move. Quiet, please. Stand by. Roll background effects. Anytime you're ready, Lester.
Within the environmental community, we've been saying for some decades now that the challenge is to save the planet. What we're beginning to realize is that the challenge is to save civilization itself. The stresses are building. They're building fast. Disappearing species, ice melting, rising sea level. You go down the list. We've not turned a single one of those around. It was Einstein who once said the thinking that got us into the situation we're in is not the thinking that will get us out of the situation. It requires a new mindset, a new approach, a new way of thinking. Recently, I was on a flight from Washington, D.C. to Beijing that took us very close to the North Pole. This meant that much of the flight was spent over the Arctic Sea. The thing that struck me about this was that wherever I could see the Arctic Sea, when there wasn't cloud cover, which was most of the time, I could see fracturing in the ice. It seemed as though it was everywhere. It was, in a sense, a sign of what's happening and what's going to happen throughout the world. In recent years, scientists have issued a flurry of studies about sea ice melting. They reported that in 1 week, an area of Arctic sea ice the size of the United Kingdom had disappeared. They were stunned.
The disappearance of sea ice in the Arctic is astonishing. The rate is much faster than any of the models had predicted, and I think that should be a warning sign to anyone who's interested in the health of the ocean and the climate of the planet.
Climate change is not a trivial issue. And we don't have to go beyond ice melting to see some of the consequences.
One of the areas where ice is melting fastest in the world is in the mountains of Asia, in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau. This is of particular concern because these are the glaciers whose ice melt sustains the major rivers of Asia during the dry season. The Indus, the Ganges, the Yangtze, and the Yellow River.
One of the challenges of thinking about a region like the Himalayas and sort of downstream of all those glacier-fed rivers is the relationship of that water supply to the reduction in glaciers, and that can have adverse impacts on actual food production.
I've tried to imagine what the Gangetic Plain with 407 million people would be like if the Ganges were not flowing, or the Yellow River, which is the lifeline of northern China. These glaciers not only sustain the flow of these rivers, they sustain the irrigation systems that produce much of the wheat and rice in Asia. This is the situation that we find ourselves in the early 21st century. It is a new situation. And it was why I was invited to Beijing, to share my concerns about climate change and food security with government officials. Based on my earlier experiences in China, I didn't expect it to be an easy few days. And they weren't.
On the morning of his first day in Beijing, just before delivering a speech to government officials, to the casual observer, it may have seemed that Lester Brown was a well-known celebrity. The reality was a bit more complex. Not all of the young bureaucrats knew about his long and at times controversial history in China.
A decade or so ago, I wrote a book entitled Who Will Feed China? And it pointed out when densely populated countries industrialize, you have to build factories and warehouses and roads and highways, all the things that come with modernization. And China was moving in that direction. I then suggested that in the near future, China would lose so much farmland to development that unless it imported massive amounts of grain and soybeans, it would not be able to feed its vast population. Now, when this book came out, it had an enormous effect in Beijing because I was not fully aware of the psychological effect of the very idea that China might have to import a large share of its food supply.
What Lester Brown didn't take into account was that it's difficult for the Chinese to forget the past. The many years of political turmoil and natural disasters that severely limited the availability of food.
And what I now know and recognize, of course, is that all the leaders in Beijing today are survivors of the Great Famine of 1959-61, when 30 million people starved to death. So this was a very sensitive issue. When I suggested in my book that China might not be able to feed itself, for a year or so I was sort of persona non grata in China. I had never experienced anything like this before. Later it was published, and when I met for the first time Premier Wen Jiabao, he said, your book was very useful to us because it did lead to a rethinking and a restructuring of Chinese agriculture.
Despite China's agricultural success, Lester Brown was once again going to deliver a message government officials didn't want to hear. He was going to tell them that what they are most proud of, rapid industrialization, could once more pose a major threat to their food security.
It was with interest yesterday as I was flying from Washington to Beijing via the polar route, and we were within 240 miles of the North Pole. When in Beijing, one of the things I talked about was the melting of the glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau. Yao Tangdang, one of the senior glaciologists in this country, has said that 2/3 of the glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau could be gone by 2060. This, he says, would be an unprecedented catastrophe. They know about the melting of the glaciers, but I don't think anyone has yet, in the public mind at least, linked the melting of those glaciers and the effect that will have on the grain harvests. What we're looking at is the need to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2020 if we want to have a chance of saving the major glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau. We don't have much time. We have to move quickly.
Later that day, as he prepared for an interview on China's English-language television station, his warm welcome was about to turn cold.
Mr. Brown, welcome to Dialogue.
I'm delighted to be here.
We've been talking about this interesting debate as to whose role it is to help more with the environmental protection, especially to prevent climate change.
We're all in this together. We all have a stake in the future of civilization. Most of us have children, some of us have grandchildren. We have to think about their world now. And if we don't act to cut carbon emissions quickly, let's say
what about developing and developed countries? There has been a lot of debate between the two camps as to whose responsibility it is to cut first.
Though the interview started cordially enough, it didn't take long before it threatened to become a debate about who should cut CO2 more, the United States or China, the world's two leading sources of greenhouse gases.
Well, all of these we have heard, but you know, sir,
Not really.
Reality right now is...
What we're seeing now is that China and India, the two countries planning to build most of the new coal-fired power plants in the world in the years ahead, are the two countries whose food security will be most directly affected by rising CO2 levels, rising temperatures, and the melting of those glaciers. So,
but you haven't answered my question. Whose responsibility is it?
Everyone's. And it's our generation's particularly, because if we do not succeed, the next generation is going to say to us, why didn't you do something when there was still time?
All right. The responsibility is everyone's, and yet who has the bigger capacity of dealing with this issue?
It's not either or. We're all in it together. I mean, China's food security...
So equal responsibility or not?
The atmosphere doesn't ask the question, are these carbon emissions coming from countries with high per capita or low per capita? Climate change is driven by the total amount of carbon emissions. As hard as I tried, I never could get the moderator to focus on what was most important, that all governments, regardless of their economic goals, needed to share the burden of cutting CO2 emissions. We are tied together now in ways we never imagined before. It is obvious that the climate system is a shared system. You can't change the climate in one part of the world without it affecting climate throughout the world.
The melting of tropical glaciers, of the glaciers in between the temperate zones, that's in the Himalayas, the Peruvian Andes, and other places in these lower latitudes, is going to be probably the most immediate cause of a lot of human suffering, the dislocation, and undoubtedly national security conflicts among regions and borders.
The link between economics, climate change, food security is probably stronger than ever before in our civilization. What climate change is doing is it's basically injecting a degree of vulnerability in the global economic system. You have new players today who are more powerful because the economies are stronger and who are able to exert more force in the world food markets.
If China wants grain, it has the billions and billions of dollars in foreign reserves to buy it. And the question is, who gets crowded out and what happens to them? You have a lot of food importing nations that really can't compete with China. That has enormous implications